Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Why Supply Chain Security Demands a Focus on Hardware and an Intro to Eclipsium. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. Before we get started, I did want to let everyone know we are recording the session, and we will make a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available. I will be sending out an email with that likely tomorrow. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We are supremely excited to have Dr. Edward Amoroso, who is the CEO of TAG and is a professor at NYU, joining us today from TAG. And he is joined by our CISO here at Eclipsium, Alan Alford. At this time, Ed, I'd like to let you go ahead and take over.
That's great. Thanks, Melissa. I appreciate it. And Alan, it's nice to see you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, this will be fun.
One thing I love, it seems like 99 times out of 100, cybersecurity webinars are software oriented. Today, we get to talk about some hardware, which I think will be fun. So I see you got in your background a couple of pieces of hardware. So that'll put it
Yeah, we got some
right
some
mood.
Eclipsium kit back there, some of the things we work on and work with.
Alan, just quickly, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you kind of got into this racket, and then
Yeah.
we're going to dive into some of the issues around supply chain.
My goodness. All right, I've been in cybersecurity longer than I care to admit. Let's say 20 plus years, we'll leave it at that. 30 counts as 20 plus, I think.
So 20 years, you're just a baby when you got
And
started.
yeah, I've been doing it. I've been in tech for 30 years, cyber for 25, I think realistically. Been a CISO multiple times in multiple industries. I've worked in data services, I've worked in publishing, I've worked in law, legal and law, I've worked in little bit everywhere, telecommunications, manufacturing, infrastructure. And I started my own consultancy a couple of years ago, got off the CISO merry-go-round, if you will, and chose some very select, small projects to work on and stumbled into Eclipsium. And I got super excited when I found out what they were doing and who they were. And I was like, pretty please let me be your CISO. And they did. So here I am and really enjoying it. Eclipsium is a fantastic company, fantastic team. Incredible mission. We'll get into that as we progress, and just an incredible team. And I'm super proud to be a part of it.
Well, that's great. I mean, I do think that one of the blind spots in our industry kind of starts at the firmware and moves down to the physical
Hmm.
componentry. When you're teaching graduate students about, translation and computer science, and as you go down, they sort of stop at machine code. They go, oh, so now we're
Yeah,
at the bottom. So I've got
right.
ones and zeros, and you go, hey, you're not all the way to the bottom yet. Those things still have to operate on something.
Yeah, they do.
I think a lot of CS like graduates and also practitioners, people you and I deal with every day,
Yep.
would probably be pretty willing to admit that there's definitely a blind spot here. So I'm so
Oh,
sorry.
there's, and what's crazy about it is if you look at the KEV database, right, the known exploits and vulnerabilities database, and you look at everything from the OS and app side to the driver and below side, get into your UEFI, your BIOS, your firmware, there's actually more stuff below that line than there is above that line. And yet 99% of the tooling in our industry only addresses the smaller portion.
So we're going to ruin everybody's sleep tonight. Is that the whole idea?
That's the plan.
So supply chain.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what we're talking about is supply chain, and I love that we're calling it that because most people listening, like a CISO or people working in a SOC or people doing compliance would say, I don't make my hardware, and that is true. Like
Hmm.
you might have some participation in the creation of software, but almost no one has involvement in the creation of hardware. That is, I think that's probably 99 point something percent.
Yep.
Is that the right sort of assumption here that people listening, when we say there might be issues with your hardware, it's that it's not something they feel a lot of direct control over?
Right. You don't have direct control to it. You don't have direct understanding of its capabilities or process even. I mean, open source software has been around for a long time. And there's always been commercial software components you could license and incorporate. So whatever line of work you are in these days, I'm going to argue that you are to some extent or another a SaaS company. I don't care if your company makes shoes. I don't care if you sell insurance. I don't care if you're making tires. somewhere your company has a public presence on the internet delivering goods and services. So every company is now a SaaS company. And every company, as a result, has really gotten smart about software. And we talk about scanning open source, and we have the tools out there to scan it and look for vulnerabilities. We can look at known CVEs. We can look at expired libraries. We can look at inherited defects of code. There are tools that will slice and dice the software umpteen million ways at the time you code, at the time you compile, at the time you check in. There's a million and one ways to control that software flow. So we all have a pretty good understanding of software, and we all have a pretty good feel for our role in software, and we're comfortable when people talk about things like software components. Now look at the hardware perspective. Unless you have had the privilege of working at a hardware company, and I won't say who it was, but imagine, if you will, a company that assembles boards, takes chips and circuitry and the green board and puts it all together, capacitors, and makes an actual, let's say, motherboard for a computer manufacturer, or a card for a network router or switch, or whatever it might be. I actually worked at one of those companies years ago, and watching how the hardware gets made, there's an analog there. We talk about the open source components and the licensed components. Obviously hardware is components, right? There's a real analog there, but seeing how the cookies are made and seeing how they run down the assembly line and seeing how they're served and seeing the subtle changes that occur in the hardware world, this is where it gets super interesting. Pick a computer brand. I don't care. Name one. We'll call it Fred's Computers. Fred competes with all the big players. And Fred will sell you the Fratitude 100, which is his latest laptop. And you will buy that. And a year later, you will buy another Fratitude 100. And these will not have the same components in them, almost guaranteed. None of the manufacturers, with a few exceptions and a few specific product lines, will guarantee you component over component that you're going to have the same product when you buy the same product even a week later. And the reason for this is, in that hardware world, the way all these shops work, I may be building a board with a penny a chip from the Philippines. And tomorrow, Taiwan comes out with a 80 cent, 0.8 cent chip that does the exact same thing. I am swapping that chip, redesigning my board, and issuing version 1A of my board, and out the door it goes with the new chips. And on and on and on it goes. Every hardware manufacturer is constantly juggling subcomponents. Every chip is coming from a distributed place in the world. Every board has tons of components from all over the place. There are BIOSes and UEFIs that are cloned and copied from manufacturer to manufacturer. I've got a friend who hacks all kinds of fun things, and he recently was hacking digital light bulbs, the ones that you can control the colors and the changes. And he found firmware in there that was from other products. It's ubiquitous. People are going to be constantly juggling and swapping out for the most efficient, most affordable, fastest acting component in their hardware. And so there's this ever-changing landscape. And most of us have no visibility into that world. Most of us don't know that story I just told. Most of us haven't seen the assembly lines cranking them out and the chip swapping happening real time on the assembly line. It's a foreign world for most of us. And as a result, I think most of us just kind of trust that it's going to do what it's paid to do, and we move on about our lives. And we've got our Vuln scans, and we've got our EDR, and we've got our CASB and our SASE and all of our cool toys, and we just kind of put blinders on when it comes to the hardware side of it. We're not familiar with it. We don't know how to address it. So we just sort of hope it takes care of itself. And that's, hope is not a strategy, right?
Regarding the size of this issue, I was thinking about yesterday. I was at a big VC conference,
Mhm.
and one of the VCs, they have one of their vendors get up and pitch and say,
Yeah.
so somebody got up and was pitching about IoT, and he had some charts. I think they were right. I wrote them down onto my phone because I wanted to ask you what you thought. I think they're right. He said that in terms of actual physical racking of servers,
Yep.
it's not as big a number as you'd think. It's in the tens of millions. But then
Mhm.
if you look at desktops, it's kind of tens of billions.
Yep.
IoT devices, hundreds of billions. And I was
Yeah.
thinking, wow, like that. I think that's right. Is
That is right.
that
That
sound
is right. It's an order of magnitude at least every time you leap up. And in the case of IoT, it's multiple orders of magnitude. And the reason for this is, I mean, you have to understand the IoT world encompasses just about everything you can think of, plus about 10,000 things you weren't thinking of. Thermostats, refrigerators, all the smart appliances in your home, electric toothbrushes. I mean, all of this stuff is internet connected now. I don't know why you'd connect a toothbrush. There are connected toothbrushes. Health monitors, every single thing in the hospital room, besides the laptop that the nurse walks in with, every single thing in there is IoT. In a standard corporate environment, your alarm system, your door controls, your cameras, your video conferencing rigs, your VoIP phones, your all of that is IoT. There are 100 of these things for every one computer in a standard environment because they're everywhere. They're innocuous. They're little bitty things we don't think
All around
about.
the office, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, everywhere, everywhere. So there is so much IoT out there. And speaking of having the privilege of having worked in the hardware space, I got to work at an IoT company as well for years. I did product security for a video conferencing company.
Mhm.
And it's that same sort of story. We've got the SBOM focus. Everyone knows SBOM. Everyone loves SBOM. We all bang the SBOM drum. This is such a wonderful thing. Tell me what's in your software. I've got tools that can take it apart and deconstruct it and tell me where it's vulnerable and all that. And just like we don't know if it's the Filipino chip or the Taiwan chip or the Japanese chip that got swapped out for whatever other chip on that motherboard, in the IoT space, who knows what's going on in there too. And again, code reuse, chip reuse, BIOS reuse, UEFI, people repurposing things from one type of tool to another. I will share a fun story. I won't say where I worked and I won't say how long ago this was, but it was at least 15 years ago. I'll say that. Um, we suddenly discovered we were part of a botnet. Products we were manufacturing were on the internet, even though we told our customers never plug them directly into the internet, always firewall them. People ignore security guidance. They were on the internet, wherever they were plugged in straight with no firewalling. We were starting to see some sort of weird compromise and starting to see these devices used as a botnet. I dug deep. I started looking into this and come to find out some of the firmware and some of the chips and our dedicated video conferencing endpoint happen to be the same firmware and chips that were in a Soho firewall, router switch combo, Wi-Fi, right? Like, that standard all-in-one, plug it in at home and it's your firewall, it's your router, it's your Wi-Fi all in one. There was common chips with common code in those chips across those two types of devices. And the botnet was attacking those devices and happened to find my devices too. And suddenly I've got thousands of my own endpoints being used for nefarious purposes. It's a really interesting world, IoT. There's a manhole cover you can lift, and when you hop down that pipe, boy, it goes forever.
Yeah. Are you on board with bill of materials as part of the solution here?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think SBOM is really smart,
I
but
think
I
it's
think,
like first step, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the S and SBOM was an add-on. Originally, it was bill of materials,
It
right?
should be. I never say SBOM anymore. I
Yeah.
always say bill of materials because it's the system that I care about.
Yes. Yes.
I get that a bunch of it's software, most of it's going to be software, but the hardware
Yeah.
stuff is important too. I mean,
Yeah.
and I will get into what Eclipsium does in a little bit because it
Mhm.
helps. But the thing that always worried me about any bill of materials is you show me it's there, and that's a good first step. Like when I buy food at the store, I like that they're forced to put all the stuff that's in there,
Yep.
even though I don't know what half of that crap is, but I feel like somebody does. Like I don't know what, some chemical formula thing is in the cookies I'm buying, but I feel like some watchdog probably. So that I sort of like, but
Right.
it just strikes me that it's not enough to just tell me what's there. There has to be some action. There has to be some
Right.
analysis. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, you're reading it right. And think about it from the manufacturer's perspective. Back to that story about the assembly line, and suddenly board number 100 cranking on the line that morning. We switch to the Taiwan chip from the Philippines chip, or maybe to the Japanese chip or the chip from Mexico or whatever it might be. Manufacturers who live in that kind of world, saving 2% of a penny per chip kind of scenario, are going to be constantly juggling and moving parts. There are engineers dedicated to nothing more than figuring out, is this chip really identical? Can we really incorporate? Do we have to make a minor modification to incorporate? Is that modification worth the dollars and pennies? And blah, 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 blah. There's a whole art form to this and a whole science to this and a very mathematically driven world behind it. And it is so in flux and so constantly changing. There is not a manufacturer on the planet going to give you the hardware equivalent of an SBOM. Because the second they publish that list and say, and we have this chip from the Philippines, tomorrow it's the Taiwanese chip. It's just they can't keep up. There's no way to do it. So what software is in those chips also at the whim of the chip manufacturers and not just the person assembling them and building the board, in many cases up to them. And so it's a never-ending rat race to try to figure out what you have. So what you start to see the need for is some kind of a third party stepping outside of that board validator, integrity checks, checksums. Is this really the real one from the manufacturer? Has it changed over time? If it changed, why and how? it gets very interesting. I sold hardware products to a certain government around the bend on the planet, if you will. And you see different security techniques for evaluating solutions before you purchase them. And in this particular case, one of the first things they did was X-rayed the whole system. And they told us, you're not allowed to change from the Filipino chip to the Taiwanese chip. You're not allowed to. We are X-raying this board, and this becomes the baseline unit that you will sell to us. We're going to deconstruct this thing, tear it apart, do everything we can to assess every piece of code and every chip. And you are going to guarantee that every unit you ship does in fact stay consistent, that you don't in fact play the chip swapping game. And we will continue to buy your product, and we will pay a premium to have you maintain that constancy over time with the hardware. And they put flags in all the software. It was incredibly complicated, but I had never seen anybody that demanding of the hardware before. And I thought, how clever these people are. Like everyone should be doing this. I would be willing to pay the premium to know that when I buy the same computer in 2 years, it's literally the same computer. That would be lovely, but that's not an option in most cases, right?
You and I should maybe start X-raying mobile apps before we use them, right? Say, hey,
There we go. There we go.
let's talk about some of the business drivers, because I think,
Mhm.
like, if anybody just sort of listening, and anybody who'd be prone to listen to you and I kind of already knows that this is an issue. But
Yeah.
the challenge that I've seen, you and I are both practitioners. I spent my life, in the CISO position, and now I coach CISOs and support them, is translating the urgency around the security risk that you and I would point to how do I make these into business requirements that I can get
Hmm.
to actually fund?
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, let's start with the first one, like, what risk? That would be something, again, you and I, if we were pitching to senior leadership saying, hey, we got to do something, we'd start by talking about risk of neglect. Like, what if you,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts? What do you think are some of the strongest arguments for not saying, the hell with it? And
Yeah.
I
So
better do something here.
I,
Where do you go when you're talking about that?
I think everybody understands, like, let's just look at the Windows operating system. Everyone understands, keep it current, patch it. Like even every, all the way up to the CEO level of almost any company you work for, if you say patch your OS, keep your Windows current, everyone knows keep it current because bad things happen. I think that's universally understood, and we all get that now.
We've more or less won that argument. Not
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah. Patch your
not that
stuff.
everybody does it,
Patch
but
your stuff, patch your stuff. We all know we're supposed to anyway, right? Now we may click the go away button because we're busy, but we know we're supposed to.
uh,
Um, when's the last time somebody patched your hardware? When's the last time you arbitrarily updated your BIOS for no reason other than, oh, I'll
that's
bet
where
there's a current
somebody
one
would
with
say, I
security
don't
fixes?
know, I don't know how to
Right.
do that. Yeah, that's
So,
correct.
so the argument I always give is, again, back to the KEV database, there's more stuff happening below the OS than there is above the OS. There really is. And every piece of hardware you have and every piece of gear you've ever bought has software in the hardware. And everyone understands you're supposed to patch your software and keep it current. And if you don't, you're in trouble. And this is BIOS, this is UEFI, this is firmware. This is all the goodness embedded in all these different chips. You can walk somebody very quickly through a map of a motherboard and point to a half dozen chips on that motherboard, each of which have their own discrete code. And what's really fun to crack their minds open is to point to one of those chips and say, and there's an entire operating system in here. Because some of these chips and some of these products, they didn't bother writing their discrete piece of code. They just grabbed a version of Linux, crammed it in there, and loaded up some open source stuff, just like you would in your SaaS product to sell your shoes and tires, right? There are whole operating systems lurking below the operating system in some cases, and everyone knows you're supposed to pass that stuff. So, there's a real risk in ignoring this, and ignoring this is unfortunately what most of us do most of the time. And the other piece I love to tell people is, um, you give the metaphor of, okay, you could have a bad word macro and hijack your word, and now bad things happen to your computer. You delete the bad thing, you reinstall the bad thing, you run your antivirus, it goes away. Then there's some clever hacker that breaks into your operating system and tweaks something in your operating system. Now you're facing a bigger problem. You have to reinstall your OS from scratch and re-clean the system and restart from scratch. And that's a bigger burden. What happens if they get you at the hardware level? You can reinstall your OS and they're right back in. And you can reinstall your OS and they're right back in. And you can reinstall you cannot win the fight with reinstalls unless you are addressing hardware at the hardware level. It is truly that simple. If I could crack your server at the hardware level, I own you completely.
Can I jump to, like, cool controversial topic now?
Yeah.
You got your hat on. You got your black hat
I got my
on.
black hat on.
Let's talk about the global issue. Like, I think that a
Yeah.
lot of people that I run into, sometimes they get talking to boards and stuff.
Yep.
They assume as long as I stay away from and then name all these scary countries, we should be fine. And I
Right.
kind of roll my eyes and think that's not the way to do supply chain security is to not avoid,
Right.
China, Russia, whatever. Tell
Yeah.
me where you're at. I think that you would agree, but do you see that too? Like sometimes you think, well,
Oh, absolutely.
as long as I just, quote unquote, buy American will be fine. And I think,
Right.
God, if only it was that simple. But what?
Right. And we're back to my story about the chips from all over the world. If your buy American company building and assembling motherboards in America wants to save 0.2 cents per board, they're going to switch to that Chinese chip if it does what it's supposed to do and it's the more affordable option. Just because the overall product is American doesn't mean the components are American. This is a global economy, people.
And also, it's been my observation, having spent a lot of time doing this damn thing for 40 something years in cyber, is that when somebody is compromised to cause a problem to hardware, software, firmware,
Mhm.
it's usually not the entire company from CEO down. It's some individual that gets coerced. And
Mhm.
they could just as easily be working for a
Mhm.
company in California as a company in
Yep.
Taiwan, right? And then
I have personally
I
been
think you can't
approached.
trust anything.
I have been approached by bad guys offering cash if I would put a back door into product X, Y, and Z when I was
I
in
mean,
charge of
you can't
securing product
trust that.
X, Y, and
So
Z.
global means that you don't just avoid a country, you act like you and I would be. Don't trust anything.
No,
Like, is
it's
that
zero
right?
trust. When it
Kind
comes to hardware, zero trust is the only possible metaphor. It truly is. And I mean, think about too, even if it's not intentional, let's say that we're going to call China the bad guys. And let's say that my Made in America board swaps out the Taiwanese chip for the Chinese chip, or the Mexican chip for the Chinese chip, or whatever it might be. Now I have a possibly suspect single chip on my big board, and it could be one with code in it. It could be a BIOS or a firmware. Any of those stories could be true. It may not be even that obvious, that black and white, or that simple. It could be much more subtle than that. And I know it's a corner case I'm about to bring up, but what happened with the exploding pagers and the exploding walkie-talkies with Hezbollah?
Oh yeah, yeah.
You want to talk about a supply chain attack? They fabricated a company that manufactured these things. They fabricated the company that sold these things. You can hijack the supply chain at any point as an entire nation, as an entire company, as to your point, one individual working on the assembly line. All you need to do is compromise any facet of any part of the chain, and the end product is now suspect. Full stop.
Let's underscore for people listening who are really interested in hardware supply chain. Alan and Ed are saying you really cannot trust your supply chain just because it's from country XYZ. You have to dig in because there's so many different attack vectors here that you have to really be pretty you have to not trust almost anything at this level. You got to do something. And we'll get to that. We're going to get
Yep.
to charts here that'll help you with the solution. In fact, let's talk a little bit about compliance and standards. Where do you
Um,
stand on this? Is this something that I mean it's rare that something would be a no-op here, but where do you stand on things like the NIST special pub in this area or other things? Are they helpful or are they kind of no-ops?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this stuff, frankly. And the reason is everything we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. What did we talk about? We talked about the fact that all of us basically put on our blinders and pretend that hardware is taken care of and okay, and I'm not going to worry about it. And part of the reason we have those blinders is because we know ultimately we don't feel like there's much we can do about it, right? It's almost an ostrich with his head in the sand scenario when it comes to cybersecurity folks and hardware. Better to just keep moving on and pretend like everything's cool because what can we do? What can we do? And what happens is big change in our industry is driven by several forces, right? And one of those forces, as we all know, can be regulation. When SOX came out, corporations really tidied up the way they did their books and the way they held their practices and the way they did things, right? Regulation forced a positive change across all industries. Well, until we have something like regulation driving hardware, it's going to be hard to get people's attention and get all those ostriches' heads out of the proverbial sand, right? So we see things like NIST SP 800-193, which is a guideline for platform firmware resiliency. But we have other stuff too. CISA came out with a BOD, right? And CISA came out with one that said, this is a directive that thou shalt take care of things at the hardware level. The White House has issued memorandums on thou shalt take care of things at the hardware level. The groundswell of regulation is starting to happen. We're right at that moment where the bubbling and churning is starting to happen before it becomes a real wave that hits all of us. My prediction is over the next 2 to 3 years, we are going to see a substantial amount of new regulation starting to address the hardware concerns. And we're going to all have to, whether we want to or not, lift the covers on that problem and start really tackling it and digging in.
Let's
So I'm
hope
a
it's
big
not
believer in this
avoid.
stuff.
I hope it's not avoid these couple of countries and you're fine. We all have to work hard to make sure
Yeah.
that the solutions are technical in nature. And with these
Yeah.
special pubs and stuff, I've read them on, they're good. It just, and we'll get to this because I can't wait to hear. I want you to share a little bit about what Eclipsium does. We're going to talk about attacks in a minute. But I think most people listening at this point would say, yeah, but I don't know what to do. Like I would say
Right.
9 times out of 10 when I bring this up,
Right.
the answer back is, Ed, I hear you, but what am I supposed to do? And I
Yeah.
think that's where I want to try and drive. But back to this, a lot of people would use the phrase firmware integrity. When you hear that phrase, what does that mean to you? Does that mean checking against some known baseline? You'd said a minute ago, you gave an example of knowing when things are changing, like this version.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
what firmware integrity means, like comparing one thing
It,
against the
It
baseline?
can be both. And we're back to this idea that the hardware manufacturers still don't publish the way software manufacturers do. SBOM, 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 we all chant and we all, can get from a lot of folks now. The hardware folks aren't doing it yet, but some of them do actually publish, hey, by the way, if you're using BIOS version 1.7a, here is the actual legitimate copy of 1.7a, referenced, checksummed, MD5, hashed, whatever you want to do. There's a lot of ways to look at it and validate. And now you can look at what's on your board, compare it to this one, and see if it's apples to apples. That's one aspect of it. And whenever the manufacturers provide that capability, we can certainly at Eclipsium work with that and do stuff with that, right? But even for the manufacturers who don't do that, there's integrity over time. It's really straightforward. Uh, just like I said, when I buy the computer and then a week later, it's a different set of chips. Wouldn't it be cool if there was a tool that can look inside those chips and go, whoa, something changed from last week?
Yeah.
If my stuff in production has firmware 1.7a and firmware 1.7a looks like X, and then tomorrow 1.7a looks like Y, and the checksums and the hashes and the various comparisons don't check out, somebody got in there and monkeyed with something and did something. There's now a change to my code, right? Some kind of change to my code. I want to know that. So integrity over time in production and integrity of manufacturer source are both sort of a way to triangulate on that.
I think that makes sense. Let's dig into some real stuff here. So, some attacks. You want to comment on any of these guys? Like
Yeah.
uh,
So
I know
Sophos,
you're
man,
familiar with these guys. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Sophos released a report, the Pacific Rim report, they called it.
Right.
And they talked about, they released it in 2024, and it was a 5-year retrospective of all the nonsense they've been up against as a manufacturer. They were hit by APTs, and these APTs were, the P stands for persistent, right? This would be an APRT or an ARPT, rabid persistence, I would call it in this case. These guys hit them where it hurt, hit them where it was easy, got found, got detected, got pushed out, came back again where it was trickier and harder, on and on and on and on. And Sophos was just under constant attack for 5 years. And some of this stuff they found actually exploited firmware and UEFI type CVEs. Stuff was getting in at the chip level. Bad things were happening in the code on the chips with some of their gear. And they found it, fixed it, eradicated it, came clean, disclosed it to the world. It was really a brilliant report. Total kudos to them for owning this and sharing this tale, because it's something we can all learn from. But it was some insane stuff. And all these APTs were ultimately traced back to, go figure, China. And it was one heck of a story. It was a big deal. And if you go read their Pacific Rim report, if you ever want to learn more about this world and this space and what it's like to fight these threats at that level, it's a brilliant read. It's a
I
great
read it.
story.
That is quite the
Oh,
thing. Really cool.
something. I mean, that is something. And then let's look at the next one, BootKitty. I love BootKitty, mainly because I'm a Linux head. But Bootkitty represents the first ever bootkit in the Linux world. It was actually, thank God, invented by friendly researchers, but it was proof of concept. It took advantage of a couple of CVEs, rolled out, validated by the community. It's real, people. Bootkits now exist for Linux too. And for those who don't know what a bootkit is, a bootkit is where it's lower than a rootkit, right? We're talking about, again, below the OS, right? It's like a rootkit, but below. The chips that load the BIOSes and get the thing started to grab the OS and load the OS, you can manipulate at that level at that moment. And tools like Secure Boot can keep that from happening. But if you don't have Secure Boot, which is basically doing integrity checking of each image before it's allowed to go into main memory, right? You can bootkit, and once you've bootkitted, you own everything. You are below the OS with full control, so you can modify and alter the OS as you see fit. There's a million nasty things you can do once you bootkit, and Bootkitty has proven to us once and for all, Linux is no longer immune to this one. For years, the Linux crowd wrote on, yeah, there's no bootkits here. Well, there is one now, gang. And the Typhoons, I love the Typhoons. Well, I hate the Typhoons, but the Typhoons are such an amazing and interesting story. So, quick side note, Ed, CISOs, industry folks, practitioners, you and I, we've had these weird jobs and these hard jobs over the years. What I want ultimately in cybersecurity, I've decided is I want to be the guy that gets to name the APTs, because whoever's doing that is having a lot of fun. We've got the Typhoons. We have Volt Typhoon, also known as Vault Typhoon. We have Flax Typhoon. We have a third Typhoon. I'll have to go look up real quick. We have Velvet Ant. There are a lot of these APTs that operate under these cool and weird names. And let me give you a quick kind of rundown on what these
Yeah,
are. So
the AV and anti-malware researchers that come up with the names, they
I
start using.
know they have way more fun than we do.
Yeah.
So Volt Typhoon was all about targeting ISPs and data persistence. Or I'm sorry, Salt Typhoon was about the ISPs and data persistence. Velvet Ant was another Chinese APT. Flax Typhoon was hijacking IoT devices. And Volt Typhoon, the original one, was actually hitting the data centers and the ISPs. And so everything we just talked about at the early part of this conversation, think about this for a moment. Data centers and ISPs. We've talked about server hardware, racking up servers and all this kind of goodness. Then we have another Typhoon strictly targeting IoT. Then we have another one strictly targeting critical infrastructure. So the Typhoons between the three of them managed to get a complete slam dunk on every one of the vulnerable populations we've discussed so far in this context, right? IoT all over the place, prevalent more than anything else on the planet, super vulnerable, and there's an APT available at a store near you that's trying to attack just that vector. And then they're hitting the data centers and the ISPs. What are we talking about there? Network infrastructure gear, server infrastructure gear. Boom, boom, boom. Double whammy on that space. All the stuff we all rely on to make our businesses go. And then finally, critical infrastructure itself, which I don't even want to go down that road today, because that's the really dark and scary road of, oh my God, the entire nation shut down and anarchy in the streets and starvation and death. And I mean, critical infrastructure is such a huge and crazy story. Three different typhoons targeting three different sectors, all of them doing essentially the same stuff, which is monkeying with the infrastructure, monkeying with the firmware, monkeying with the BIOSes, monkeying with the hardware, finding ways to break in and take over. And when you talk about IoT, is there a difference between the IoT device, the firmware, the software, the BIOS, the product? It's all one and the same with IoT, right? Like it's not like there's an OS layer you're really attacking with IoT. You're going straight for the guts every time. And so these are just some random examples, right? The Pacific Rim Report, go read it. It's super interesting. The persistence of these bad guys and the way they just kept coming back with more and more clever techniques and what they would exploit. Bootkitty, friendly researchers found that one, guys. If the friendlies are finding it and reporting it, the bad guys are finding it and not reporting it.
That's true.
And then all the different typhoons. There's a great article on Eclipsium's blog. If you go to eclipsium.com/blog, you can read all these blog articles. Paul Asadorian wrote most of these. They're really, really good stuff. He's a super brilliant guy in the industry. And it's some amazing stuff. Just read about the typhoons and read about Velvet Ant too. But I'm telling you, Ed, I want to be the guy that names them. I want to go back to the research side of the house. If that's what it takes to get to name these things, I want to be that guy.
The three bullets that we put there next to Eclipsium Solutions, they
Mhm.
correspond to what I now share back with enterprise teams when they ask, what are the categories of requirements that I should have here? I think that it's a good taxonomy.
Yeah.
Integrity monitoring,
Yep.
anomaly detection, patch and update, like those strike me as when you go, all right, what do I do? If I'm talking to a manager, they need to have something in a broad category. Are those the
Yeah.
right three? I mean, that's what I've been using. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
that's it. I think that's the right three bullets. And think about what we do above the OS, like think about the OS and up versus the drivers and down kind of scenario, like we talked about at the beginning. What do I do day to day? I have detection and response, right? I have vuln scans. I have a patch management program based on the results of my vuln scans. Really, what we're saying is you should be doing all those same types of things below, right? So integrity monitoring, let's scan, let's detect, and let's flag, and let's alert, and let's let somebody on a console and on eyes of glass, eyes on a pane of glass kind of thing, let them see like, whoa, hey, 7 of our servers are now running a wonky version of what yesterday was a clean BIOS. Let's go look at those 7 servers. Or something as simple as, hey, there's a known bad version installed on these 14 servers. You guys need to update. The manufacturer has released a warning that there's known vulnerabilities. You're on version 7A. You need to be on version 9C. Go get it, guys. It's changed since yesterday. It's changed from the one the manufacturer published and said is there. Like, let's get eyes on glass. Let's look at this stuff the same way we look at everything above. And anomaly detection. What's acting funky? What seems to have malware? What's doing weird stuff? Same kind of thing we do above, let's do below. And then timely updates and patch management. Give me a console that lets me manage all this and see all this and understand what I'm doing. If I've got 17 servers that all need the same update, let me know that. Give me a console. Let's look at that. That's basically it, really.
I mean, this platform, I've spent a lot of time with you guys over the last 2 or 3 years, and I don't think there's a lot of competition here for Eclipse, and this is what I think people should be
Yeah.
looking at in this area. But here's I guess the biggest question, Alan. There's a lot of people listening to us right now, most probably listening to the recording, who are thinking, I don't make my hardware, so what do I do? Now,
Right.
obviously, if you're a manufacturer, whatever, I mean, should they be using the platform and embedding it into their data center operation? Should they be directing the IT? Help me with the action. Like, okay,
Yeah.
I love this, but what do I do? I think
Yeah.
we're mostly talking to security geeks here.
Sure.
What
Sure.
does a security person do to?
Yeah. So let me lead by saying, first of all, these days I identify as a business CISO more than a technical CISO, right? And I've been that way for years now. I think of myself as much more business centric than technical centric. But that's not to say I don't still geek out. That's not to say I don't have an incredibly elaborate home network with a bazillion weird devices on it, and then I'm super paranoid about things like smart fridges and those sorts of things. So naturally, what I did as soon as I joined Eclipsium, again, I heard about their mission and got all excited. I was like, please let me be your CISO. They said yes. I came in. I'm the CISO. Great. Awesome. Give me your toy. I want to play with it on the home network. First thing I did, loaded it, deployed it, ran it, scanned, came back and went, what? I found stuff, and I'm talking about just, I don't know what we've got, 15 devices that are true, devices, and maybe another 20 IoT type things on my network. Man, I found some stuff with Eclipsium that none of my security stack had found. Nothing. I found corrupt BIOSes. I found BIOSes that weren't the real ones from the manufacturer. I found ones that were just out of date, and we knew for a fact that Eclipsium was telling me, dude, you're 14 versions behind, and the new one's got fixes to at least 3 known vulnerabilities. It was insane what I found just on the home network. And so extrapolate to the enterprise with that story, and you can see where very quickly you can find thousands of things. If I'm an enterprise cybersecurity team, I want to deploy this and run it against my entire laptop fleet. I want to run it against my server fleet. I want to run
But
it against
how
my
do you have
network
to do that? Like,
infrastructure.
I probably would want to sit down with the IT operations team, I'm thinking.
Mhm.
Like, you find, I'm just trying to translate to everyone I deal
Yeah. So yeah, so look
kind
at
of
the
thing that
physics.
the IT team and the security, you're going to have to work with them
Oh,
probably.
absolutely. It's the same thing as your vuln management story. Think of that
Right.
analog, right?
Good example.
I'm going to run Rapid7 Nessus, whatever. I'm going to run a bunch of vuln scans and I'm going to find a bunch of stuff. And it's ultimately IT's jurisdiction. I'm finding flaws and stuff
That's
IT
right.
owns and controls. And then I have to coordinate with IT and say, hey, IT team, y'all really need to fix these 7 criticals and these 4 mediums and whatever the dialogue is. And you've got processes in play and even committees potentially, depends on how large and mature your enterprise is. It's the same story here. right? You want to run this tool. You want to find the bad things. You want to issue the report. You want to sit down with your chums in IT and you want to say, hey guys, we got some criticals we got to address. This is some scary stuff you're looking at. And it might be their Cisco infrastructure. It might be their Dell servers. It might be their HP laptops. It might be the who knows what your shop has got, where it's got, what it's got. We're going to find the things, report the things, and give you a lovely console so that you can do that same sort of stuff you would do with a vuln management solution. And in some ways, it's even almost more like an EDR type console. And it's the same story still there, right? You're going to have security folks with their eyes on this pane of glass, but you're going to ultimately be coordinating with the infrastructure teams, the IT teams, the network teams, and whoever else it takes to get this stuff over the finish line. I never recommend that security be the one pushing updates live and direct to production. Always rope in your pals in IT. It's got to be a joint effort to be done. Security should be the spotters, IT should be the fixers, but under the jurisdiction and the guidance of those spotters. And this tool lets you be the spotter, lets you give the guidance, and lets you supervise and monitor the results to make sure it actually got done right.
I mean, am I going back to like like in the and the diagram that we have here with Lenovo? Would I be, if I find some problems, then with my IT and maybe my supply chain team, and God, it could even be the lawyers, I'm probably going back to them, presenting my findings,
Yeah.
and kind of saying WTF? Is it like
Yeah, that is absolutely one scenario that you can get to. And you know, one of the scenarios I love the best when we talk about uses for the Eclipsium tool, because I got so excited when I found out about these guys. I was like, please let me be your CISO.
Yeah.
I was like thinking through all the past moments in my CISO career where I could have used a tool like this. And one of the ones that just popped immediately into my mind was M&A. If you're lucky as a CISO and you've earned your seat at the table as a CISO, before your company buys another company, they will bring you in early to do a full assessment of that company and get a feel for what the security burden is you're going to inherit. And potentially you can even benefit the deal. Like if you find out there's $1 million worth of stuff to fix in terms of security burden, you can go back to the legal team and the CFO and say, hey, you're knocking $1 million off the asking price because we're going to have to pay $1 million to fix this up, right? There's this great dialogue you can get into as the CISO with an M&A team. Well, what if you're a Lenovo shop and you're inheriting a Dell shop? Or what if you're a Dell shop inheriting an HP shop or whatever? It doesn't matter which manufacturers. You can run a tool like Eclipsium against that fleet you're about to inherit, and you can get a real feel real quick for what you're actually up against. It's a brilliant use case. And I think that kind of predictive capability, that far-reaching, what is my fleet telling me and where am I at as a whole? You know, you'll find the outliers in every tool like this. I don't care if you're talking EDR, Vulnscans, Eclipsium, whatever. You're always going to find the few outliers that are the super high criticals that you can jump on and punch down very quickly. But it's much more telling to me to know that that entire wave of laptops, because IT buys gear in waves, right? The 2018 wave came in and we bought 10,000 units and told everybody they got to last 3 years. And now it's actually been 4 or 5 years. Most of them are still deployed. And where are we at really with the bulk of the fleet? Tools like this can help you with that too. And that can help influence IT purchasing decisions. You can empower the CIO to say, you know what, guys, I don't care what you said about budget. We got so much risk now, we have to update this fleet. You just made a best friend in the CIO. You can also go back to the manufacturer and say, we're on your current BIOS, and we're seeing that there's lots and lots and lots of problems with your current BIOS. You need to fix this ASAP because I got 10,000 vulnerable systems now. There's a lot of stories that play out. Having eyes on this pane of glass, being able to see below the surface and see what's actually going on, you are empowered to a degree that none of your peers are once you have a tool like this. All that stuff we talked about above the OS and below the OS, get yourself full visibility, get yourself full capability, get yourself fully aware of what's happening above and below, and you will be the empowered CISO who can do all kinds of things, whether it's talking to your CIO, CFO, purchasing department, the vendor themselves, whatever, empower yourself.
Well, if people go to your website, go to eclipsium.com and ask for like briefing and so on. Do they usually do like a POC or something, kick the tires? How do you
Yeah. We can
how do you
work with
get the
folks.
car?
Yeah, we can work with folks and do whatever folks want to do. Obviously, I'm not in sales. I'm not an SE. But I know that we've done a lot of work with a lot of companies that, you know, come by if you're curious and we'll work with you. Let's just say that.
Some people do. I've been a proponent of this. I've looked at Eclipsium for a number of years and think that this is Like I said at the beginning, I think it's a blind spot in our industry. So I'm glad you guys are
Yep.
doing well. I'm glad you're working there. This is good stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Really
We got 3 questions. If you want to tackle some Q&A, we had some
Why don't we
questions
top
come in.
up? Why don't we pop in? Let's see what
Yeah,
the,
Mick Talley popped in here and said, any thoughts on third-party risk mitigation? We bankers are concerned about that one. So yeah, 3PRM, traditional 3PRM is what? Security questionnaires, and now we have trust centers, and now we have audits potentially as a bank. You usually, depending on the size of your bank, you're going to hold out for right to audit and these kinds of things. Third-party risk is not inclusive of all this hardware supply chain stuff. And I think we are nicely plugging into and complementing a third-party program by pulling in that facet and showing you that piece of it. Because if you can prove to a vendor based on some prototype units you brought in and, give me 5 units to play with kind of thing, before you commit to the 5,000 deal, use us. And you've got better third-party risk management than you've ever had before. So we dovetail nicely with a 3PRM mindset for sure.
Mick's also asking about zero trust.
Zero trust, my favorite. So zero trust, the hyped up marketing phrase, forget it, toss it in the trash. Zero trust, the actuality. I love zero trust. Let's talk about that for a minute. What you're saying with zero trust is trust nobody ever, ever, really, no, really. I mean it. That's a hard thing to do. And the amount of trust we put in our hardware, BIOS, and firmware today is insane. We are operating at 100% trust right now. We should be at zero trust in this space. We're not at a point yet, total transparency, where we can enforce, but we can certainly snap it, monitor it, help you patch it and fix it, and know exactly what you've inherited and what mess you have on your hands. And do not trust your hardware supply chain. Do not trust the BIOS. Do not trust the UEFI. Do not trust the firmware. Do not trust anything you've received without cracking that manhole cover open and looking down that deep, deep, deep hole.
That makes good sense. So, listen, Alan, on behalf of my team at TAG, I want to thank you, everybody listening, and awesome conversation. We'll have to push out 6 months and catch up and see how things go into the year. But thanks for joining.
I love it. Thank you, Ed.
I'm going to turn it back to Melissa to close us out. Thanks, Melissa. Thanks for hanging in there with us.
You bet. And thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. I will be sending out a link to the recording and the slides, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session. We'll also have a couple of interesting new resources that we will be tacking in there. A couple of the blog posts that Alan referenced, along with a new report that we actually did with TAG here recently, just to give you a little bit more clarity on hardware and the firmware attacks that are happening. So hope to see you on our next webinar. Our next one will be on December 19th. We are going to be talking about securing your network devices and the proven strategies to defend against supply chain attacks. So hope to see you on that last one before the end of the year. Thank you again, Ed, and thanks, Alan. And thanks to everyone.
Y'all later.
Thank you all.